So the practice of the presence of God. Today we're going to be focusing on this spiritual classic written by Brother Lawrence. It's among an exclusive list of rarefied spiritual classics that have remained perennial, beloved, and profoundly transformative for centuries. What's made this spiritual classic so profoundly influential is its complete simplicity. There are actually lots of different editions of this text, but we recommend in the following edition. This is The Practice of the Presence of God with a foreword by Henry Nouwen. And this was done in 1977. So it's a little bit more current version. And let's go. This is give you a couple of endorsements of this. Hannah Whitall Smith, she lived from 1832 to 1911. She was a prominent preacher in the 19th century holiness movement and author of the phenomenally popular The Christian Secret of a Happy Life. She wrote in the preface to the 1897 edition of the text of Brother Lawrence's book by Fleming H. Revel. Here's what she said. The value of this little book is its extreme simplicity. Brother Lawrence was not troubled by any theological difficulties or doctrinal dilemmas. For him, these did not exist. His one single aim was to bring about a conscious personal union between himself and God. What Brother Lawrence did, all can do. No theological training or any especially theological views are needed for the blessed practice he recommends. No gorgeous churches, not stately cathedrals, no elaborate ritual could either make it or mar it. This little book, therefore, seems to me one of the most helpful I know. It fits into the lives of all human beings, let them be rich or poor, learned or unlearned, wise or simple. A.W. Tozer, he passed away in 1963. He could write of Brother Lawrence, one of the purest souls ever to live on this fallen planet was Nicholas Herman, known as Brother Lawrence. He wrote very little, but what he wrote has seemed to several generations of Christians to be so rare and so beautiful as to deserve a place near the top among the world's great books of devotion. The writings of Brother Lawrence are the ultimate in simplicity, ideas woven like costly threads to make a pattern of great beauty. There are probably no other books on prayer that we could recommend with such enthusiasm. However, here are a couple of other classics that are extraordinarily fruitful for the purposes of deepening one's prayer life. One of these is Waiting on God. This is by Andrew Murray, and the other is Thomas à Kempis, The Imitation of Christ. Both of these books would be highly recommended if you have not yet read them. Now a little more about Brother Lawrence. The exact date of his birth is unknown. And then he died in 1691. He was born in Hermansnil, France, and born with the name Nicholas Herman. At age 18, he served in the army, the forces of Lorraine, in the war we remember today as the 30 Years' War. He was wounded, and this led to his exit from military service. He served as a footman to William de Froubat, who was the treasurer of the King of France. In relating this detail, he says that he was a clumsy lummox who broke everything. And so we can imagine he did not excel in this position. Following this episode, he attempted to live as a hermit. Although his first foray into the monastic life did not prove successful, he later applied to the Discalced Carmelites on the Rue des Vaugirard in Paris. He was welcomed into the monastery and received the name Brother Lawrence of the Resurrection. The Discalced, or those without shoes, Carmelites, represent a reform movement within the Carmelite order. These Roman Catholic monks and nuns devote themselves to contemplative prayer. Saint Teresa of Avila and John of the Cross are considered the founders of this monastic order, and both have been renowned in their own regard. So Brother Lawrence was a Roman Catholic. Roman Catholic readers were at first suspicious of Brother Lawrence, since he talked about finding God's presence apart from the church and generally discouraged religious disciplines. The Protestant readers were at first suspicious of Brother Lawrence, since he lived a life of a monk and pursued contemplative prayer and does not base his method of prayer on biblical study. Brother Lawrence worked in the kitchen of the monastery, but he learned that he was able to pray as effectively and as sweetly while busy in the kitchen as while in the monastery chapel. As Brother Lawrence had found such an advantage in walking in the presence of God, it was natural for him to recommend it earnestly to others. But his example was a stronger inducement than any arguments he could propose. His very countenance was edifying, such a sweet and calm devotion, appearing in it as could not but affect the beholders. And it was observed that in the greatest hurry of busyness in the kitchen, he still preserved his recollection and heavenly mindedness. He was never hasty nor loitering, but did each thing in its season with an even, uninterrupted composure and tranquility of spirit. The time of busyness, he said, does not with me differ from the time of prayer. And in the noise and clatter of my kitchen, while several persons are at the same time calling for different things, I possess God in a great tranquility, as if I were upon my knees at the Blessed Sacrament. So in this conversation that he had with the Lord in the contemplative tradition, Brother Lawrence converted when he was 18 years old. As he relates the story in the practice of the presence of God, it was in winter when he saw a tree and was filled with the overwhelming sense that God would bring fresh life into the tree in the spring. He told me that one day, while looking at a tree stripped of its leaves and reflecting that before long its leaves would appear anew, then its flowers and fruits would bloom. He received an insight into the providence and the power of God, which has never erased from his soul. This is the reality. This is really a perfect statement of the contemplative tradition, that our task in the pursuit of spirituality is really only to be responsive to God and exercise patience. Let me read that again because I misspoke it. This is really a perfect statement of the contemplative tradition, that our task in the pursuit of spirituality is really only to be responsive to God and exercise patience. This is much like Jesus's teaching to abide in the vine from John 15:4. Abide in me and I in you. As the branch cannot bear fruit by itself unless it abides in the vine, neither can you unless you abide in me. So yes, as we continue on, we're going to discuss some of the different principles that are covered in Brother Lawrence's book. It's not really a book per se, but actually it's more of a collection of materials assembled by Joseph de Buffont, who was the abbot of Brother Lawrence's monastery. Joseph de Buffont only published the book after Brother Lawrence's death. The book is composed of the following different conversations. So there were actually 4 conversations that are pointed out in the book. And again, these are written by Joseph de Buffont and represent recollections of conversations that he had with Brother Lawrence about spiritual life. The book then has 16 letters. These are letters by Brother Lawrence about practicing the presence of God. We have only 16 letters because Brother Lawrence wrote very little, and he actually destroyed most of what he had written, claiming it to be unworthy. Then there are also spiritual maxims. These are material, or most of this material is drawn from the conversations and the letters and represents an attempt to systematize Brother Lawrence's method of devotion. So what we're going to do today is attempt to distill Brother Lawrence's teaching down to 5 different principles. Brother Lawrence himself rejects the idea that this method can be reduced because he sees it as already completely and utterly simple. He presents his method in a book as a series of interlocking themes. However, for the purpose of this teaching and reviewing Brother Lawrence's method, we have taken the liberty of articulating the practice excuse me, of the presence of God in discrete principles. So, yeah, with that caveat, we'll go through some of the main principles that we see, excuse me, in his book. So, principle 1, we place ourselves in God's presence by continually conversing with Him. In the 4th conversation, Joseph Defont writes, Brother Lawrence spoke to me openly and with great fervor of his way of going to God. He told me that it consists of renouncing one for all, everything, or renouncing once for all, everything that we know does not lead to God, so that we might accustom ourselves to a continual conversation with Him, a conversation free of mystery and of utmost simplicity, that we need it only to know God intimately present in us, to address ourselves to Him at every moment, to ask His aid, to discern His will in doubtful things, and to do well those things we see clearly He is demanding of us, offering them to Him before doing them, and giving Him thanks for having done them for Him after we have done them. This is perhaps the most succinct statement of Brother Lawrence's method of prayer anywhere. And that's in the 4th conversation where we find that passage. Brother Lawrence said that we should establish ourselves in the presence of God by continually talking to Him, that it was a shameful thing to allow thoughts of trivial things to break into this conversation. I keep myself in His presence by simple attentiveness and a loving gaze upon God, which I can call, which I can call the actual presence of God, or to put it more clearly, an habitual silent and secret conversation of the soul with God, which sometimes causes me interior and often exterior happiness and joy, so great that in order to moderate them and prevent their outward manifestation, I am obliged to resort to behavior that seems more foolishness than piety. That's in his 5th letter. And then in the 16th letter, he writes, you would think it rude to leave a friend alone who came to you. Why abandon God and leave Him alone? And again, are we not ill-mannered, even culpable, to leave Him alone while we busy ourselves with 1,001 trivial matters which displease Him and perhaps even offend Him? Though He tolerates them, it is to be feared that one day they will be costly. They will cost us dearly. So again, with this first principle, we place ourselves in God's presence. We must make our hearts a sanctuary where we adore Him continually. It's in the 15th letter. The presence of God is the applying of our spirit to God, or a realization of the presence of God, which can be brought about either by the imagination or by the understanding. And that's in one of the spiritual maxims. So we want to place ourselves in His presence. Principle 2, when we realized we have sinned, simply confess to God and return to His presence. When we sin, we simply return to God in repentance without dwelling on past sins. A.W. Tozer writes, Brother Lawrence expressed the highest moral wisdom when he testified that if he stumbled and fell, he turned at once to God and said, "O Lord, this is what you may expect of me if you leave me to myself." He then accepted forgiveness, thanked God, and gave himself no further concern about the matter. He simply repented. that when he stumbled, he simply acknowledged his fault and said to God, I shall never do otherwise if you leave me to myself. It is up to you to keep me from falling and to correct what is wrong. With this, he put the pain of his fault from his mind. He told me that he had no scruples, for when I know I have failed, I acknowledge it and say, that is what I usually do when I'm left to myself. If I have not failed, I give thanks to God and acknowledge it is his doing. And that comes from the second conversation as well. So we move on to principle 3. One way to bring ourselves into God's presence is to do everything for the love of God. One way to arrive at this is to do all things for love. Don't stop what you're doing in order to experience God's presence, but start doing what you're doing for the love of God. Love is the basis of everything. And this is a quote from him, that our sanctification depended not upon changing our works, but in doing for God what we ordinarily do for ourselves. He goes on to say that he was gratified when he could pick up a straw from the ground for the love of God, seeking him alone and nothing else, not even his gifts. This is how Brother Lawrence turned his work for the monastery into prayer. Whether it was traveling to Burgundy to purchase wine or working in the kitchen or the shoe repair shop, Brother Lawrence learned to do all for the love of God and to make his life a prayer to God. He goes on to say that all the mortifications and other exercises are useful only insofar as they bring us to union with God through love. That after having given much thought to the matter, he had concluded the shortest path to God was by continual exercise of love, while doing all things for the love of God. Brother Lawrence claimed to be so controlled, by his awareness of God's will that he said, I am so resigned that I would not lift a straw from the ground except in accordance with his order. So we move on to principle 4. We abandon self-justifying religious works. Brother Lawrence gives some indication that he failed to enter into this awareness of the presence of God when he practiced religious life most rigidly. Isn't that interesting? And something that I think we would be well to guard against. This is also where the theme of abandoning oneself to God comes in. To abandon oneself to God means to cease from all religious observance as a means of attaining God. Brother Lawrence joined the religious life thinking that the renunciation would be miserable, but discovered instead great pleasure. That he had desired to become a religious, thinking that by doing so, he would be censured for his clumsiness and faults, and so would sacrifice his life and all its pleasures to God. But that God had outwitted him, and in his religious life, he had found nothing but satisfaction. He stated that in his first conversation. In his third conversation, he said that he was more united with God in his ordinary activities than when he devoted himself to religious activities, which left him with a profound spiritual dryness. So he really did learn how to practice the presence of God in a very natural, normal, life-giving way. One must empty oneself of all else, he said. I know that to achieve this, the heart must be emptied of all other things, for God wishes to possess it alone. And as he cannot possess it alone without emptying it of everything that is not himself, so neither can he act there and do what he wishes there unless it is empty of all else. It is necessary, however, he says, to put our complete trust in God, putting aside all other cares, even certain devotions, which, though very good in themselves, are often engaged in for the wrong reasons, since these devotions are only the means to attain the end. Thus, by this exercise in the presence of God, we are with him who is our end. It is useless for us to resort to the means, but we can continue our communion of love with him, living in his holy presence, at one time by an act of adoration, of praise, of desire, at another time by an act of resignation or of thanksgiving, and in any other way our spirit can conceive. He goes on to say, it is not necessary to be always in church to be with God. We can make a private chapel of our heart where we can retire from time to time to commune with him peacefully, humbly, lovingly. So it's really about emptying ourselves and filling that space with God. And doing that not only through devotions and various religious activities, although he found those things far less beneficial, but to just simply love God and be looking for the love of God in filling with all of things throughout our lives. In this simple, humble relationship. Principle 5, we seek to pray in complete simplicity. It is the simplicity of what Brother Lawrence proposes that first arrests the attention of the reader and the commentator. This is probably the best summary of Brother Lawrence's method of prayer, simplicity. In acting in his own simple way, he was doing all for the love of God, thanking him for directing his activities and doing numerous other acts of love. But all were done very simply, in such a way as to keep him in the loving presence of God. That was in the third conversation. In the fourth, he goes on to say that we must act very simply with God and speak to him frankly while asking his help in things as they occur. And again, that goes along with the continual conversation with God about small matters and large alike. Just having that simple devotion to him. He goes on to say, if I were a preacher, I would preach nothing else but the practice of the presence of God. If I were a spiritual director, I would recommend it to everyone. So necessary and so easy do I believe it to be. Henry Nouwen writes in his preface to the book, he says, our lives are fragmented. There are so many things to do, so many events to worry about, so many people to think of, so many experiences to work through, so many tasks to fulfill, so many demands to respond to, and so many needs to pay attention to. Often it seems that just keeping things together asks for enormous energy. Different powers pull us into different directions, and our sense of unity and togetherness is constantly threatened. This fragmentation is probably one of the most painful experiences of modern men and women. Students and teachers, doctors and lawyers, scholars and business people, yet even ministers and priests all complain that life has become so busy and that it is hard to keep the pieces together. Underneath the running and rushing of modern life often lurks the nagging feeling of being disconnected, alienated, and bored. Although we are busy, we experience ourselves as the passive victims of great powers that control us and seem very hard to resist. Life seems like a long series of randomly scattered incidents and accidents over which we have no control. No direction, no goals, no unity, no sense of meaning. And so while we are busy, we feel an inner emptiness. And while we hardly know how to keep up with the many things asking for our attention, we feel bored. Nouwen gives a penetrating analysis of modern life. Even though this was written about 44 years ago, back about 1977. Doesn't it sound familiar today? He introduces the simplicity of Brother Lawrence's method of prayer as the balm needed for our modern people. So the habit. The practice of the presence of God is a habit. It is a way to ingrain a spiritual habit that results in a perpetual, conscientious awareness of the presence of God. That in the beginning, a persistent effort is needed to form the habit of continually talking with God and to refer all we do to Him. But after that, a little care. His love brings us to it without any difficulty. After describing his method of practicing the presence of God, Brother Lawrence writes, finally, the effect of repeating these acts is that they become more habitual, and the presence of God becomes, as it were, more natural. So the more we practice this, the more normal, the more natural it will become. In Ken Boa's book, The Life in the Presence of God, he gives us his philosophy of prayer, which is very much patterned after Brother Lawrence's practicing in the presence of God. At the conclusion of one chapter, Boa makes an astounding observation about the flight of eagles. Eagles learn to soar by discerning thermal columns, which means that although they have to flap wildly to achieve liftoff, they soar by positioning themselves in the thermal columns. So we may have to work hard to begin the habit of prayer, but then the habit begins to carry and fashion us. So a concluding thought, and this comes from the 9th letter. Yeah, we cannot avoid the dangers and perils with which life abounds without the actual and unceasing help of God. Let us ask his help continually. How can we ask for his help unless we are with him? How can we be with him except by thinking of him often? How can we think of him often except by forming a holy habit of doing so? You will tell me that I am always saying the same thing to you. It's true. I do not know of an easier or more appropriate method. And as I practice no other, I recommend it to everybody. We must know before we can love. To know God, we must think often of him. And when we come to love him, we shall also think of him very often. For our heart is where our treasure is. Let us ponder this often and deeply.